Hello and welcome to this installment of the University of New Mexico Biodiversity webinar series. I'm Senator Tom Udall and I'm pleased to be the honorary co-host of this series. There are few things more important to our nation than protecting the land that we love and the diversity of the species it sustains for future generations. Thanks to Dr. Banerjee and my friends at UNM for offering this public webinar, and thanks to all of you watching for staying engaged. The challenges we face can feel daunting sometimes, but together we can make a difference. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you to Senator Tom Udall for your welcome message. Thank you all for joining us this evening for the fourth and final in the Biodiversity webinar series. The series is organized by the Species in Peril project at the University of New Mexico in partnership with the Office of U.S. Senator Tom Udall, Office of Congresswoman Deb Haaland, New Mexico Biopark Society, the Indigenous Design and Planning Institute at the UNM School of Architecture and Planning, and the Southwest Environmental Center. We are very grateful to Senator Tom Udall for serving as honorary co-host. My name is Kevin Bixby. I'm the founder and executive director of the Southwest Environmental Center. I'm speaking to you from New Mexico, actually Las Cruces, New Mexico. And New Mexico is the traditional homelands of the indigenous Pueblo, Diné, Apache, the Ute, and other indigenous peoples. I have the honor of moderating tonight's conversation. The significance of our topic tonight, transforming state wildlife management to protect biodiversity in the United States, may not be apparent to some of you, but I hope that you will be persuaded after tonight that it is of huge importance to the future of wildlife in America. Many of you know that the world is facing a mass extinction crisis, a catastrophic biological meltdown as human activities are driving species to disappear at frightening rates. Habitat destruction, climate change, overexploitation, pollution, and introduction of invasive species are all taking their toll on species and ecosystems across the planet. An estimated 1 million species are nearing extinction. Populations of mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, and fishes have declined by an average of 68% since the first Earth Day was celebrated in 1970. 68%. The US is not immune to these threats. Nearly 3 billion birds have disappeared in North America since 1970. Over 1,300 species are officially recognized as endangered or threatened on the federal list, and many thousands more have been identified by states as species of conservation concern. In short, all the dashboard warning lights are flashing. We are about to go off a cliff and running out of time to avoid it. So why are the states important? Unlike most countries, the United States does not have a national biodiversity action plan. Under our federalist system of government, we have left it to the states to manage most of the wild animals within their borders. There are exceptions, for example, species protected under the Federal Endangered Species Act and migratory birds, but for the most part, it is states that decide if and how a species is to be protected. For better or worse, states are in the driver's seat when it comes to addressing the extinction crisis in the United States. That is what we will be discussing tonight. Following our conversation, we will reserve the last 15 to 20 minutes of our time for the panelists to respond to questions from you, the audience. So we invite you to post your questions in the Q&A section, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. I am honored and humbled to share the stage with tonight's three distinguished panelists. They each have devoted their lives to saving wildlife, although their calling has taken them along different paths. Professor Adrian Treves is the founder and director of the Carnivore Coexistence Lab at the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies, University of Wisconsin-Madison. He has authored more than 133 scientific papers, helping to bring intellectual rigor and clarity to many challenging wildlife issues. Louisa Willcox has spent a career in the nonprofit world advocating for the preservation of wilderness and wild animals of the Northern Rockies, with a special passion for large carnivores. She and her husband continue to be leading advocates for grizzly bear recovery from their home in Montana. Fred Koontz is a wildlife scientist who, over his 35-year career in wildlife conservation, has worn many hats, working in the zoo, field, and university settings. He remains active in retirement and serves on several advisory committees to the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. Adrian, Louisa, and Fred, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us this evening.
My pleasure, Kevin.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for hosting.
You bet. Let's begin with our first question. Given the current biodiversity emergency, how ought wildlife conservation in the United States look like today and moving forward? What should be the priorities, and what might some of the policies and institutions needed to achieve those goals look like? Adrian, I'd like to invite you to begin.
Great, thanks, Kevin. Really a pleasure. Great question, too. So, in my view, we may have taken a wrong turn about 120 years back, and we need to go back to the principles of the US public trust doctrine. We'll talk about that more this evening, but I want to remind folks that the people are sovereign in the United States and every democracy around the world. And the sovereignty is where the power lies, and it lies with the people. Our Constitution explains what authorities we give to our government. So the US Constitution speaks to the federal government. And you're bringing up the states quite appropriately. They are co-trustees along with the US federal government. And so are all the tribal nations across the US, all co-trustees. So for example, the state of Wisconsin shares trustee duties with the Ojibwe tribal nations in the land we now call Wisconsin, and those co-trustee duties extend over about a third of the state of Wisconsin. That's a shared trustee responsibility, and can't wait to get into what does that mean to be a trustee. Thanks for that question, Kevin.
Sure. Louisa, your thoughts?
Yeah, and thank you very much. And thanks to Senator Tom Udall and the University of New Mexico and you, Kevin, and all of the partners in this project. To me, I need to start with kind of where I'm coming from in terms of wildlife management, because I hold the view that we and wild animals are shared travelers in this world. And the wild animals have a lot to teach us about resilience and compassion and skill. And that, as Robin Kimmer said in the last panel and did it beautifully, we're not talking about natural resources here. We're talking about a shared extended family. So that is my view of wildlife management writ large. And I hold the principles of democracy to be really important, of fairness and equity and transparency and accountability. And that sounds like a lot of blah, blah, blah to people. So maybe a little bit of perspective, what it's like as a grizzly bear and wolf advocate walking into a meeting in Montana or Wyoming and being greeted with a sea of cowboy hats and white males primarily, including up against, the far wall, and realize that you're being dismissed first by being a woman, and secondly by speaking up for wildlife, especially large carnivores that are particularly fraught. And it feels very dismissive and disrespectful. And I know we'll talk more about that, but we can do better. And I envision also replacing the current business model that treats all wildlife as customers, which is the current situation with what Adrian was talking about as a shared public trust. We need a system that reflects this shared public trust of wildlife. And to me, and lots of other people, animals are not widgets. There's not something that can simply be utilized and bought and sold. They are larger beings. And in the case of grizzly bears and wolves, nationally iconic, important species to everybody across the country, I envision a system where we have federal authority that gives a voice to all Americans, even if these animals are removed from the protections of the Endangered Species Act, perhaps not unlike the Bald Eagle Protection Act. So I appreciate that opportunity for these introductory remarks, and I'm fascinated by what happens tonight.
Fred?
If I was talking to a group of students and they asked, what is wildlife conservation? I'd probably roll off a sort of a definition like wildlife conservation is the set of actions and relationships that ensure the sustainability of wildlife species, populations, and diversity. But really, I think for our discussion tonight, we need to think a little deeper about what I would call the why, the who, and the how of wildlife conservation. Sometimes we just launch right into things like wildlife conservation. We don't stop and think about, well, why are we doing wildlife conservation? And historically, if we go back that 120 years that Adrian mentioned, it was really about consumption of wildlife and the use of wildlife. And unfortunately, this has gone on, to be the primary motive still to many wildlife state agencies. It's about production and harvest. But for more than 50 years now, there's, as many of you in the audience know, that there's been a growing consensus and support for the idea that wildlife conservation, really biodiversity conservation, is much more important because it's really the foundation of everything that humans do. And it is the foundation for our economy. It's the foundation for our health, for our well-being. There's nothing if we don't have that biodiversity foundation that, Kevin, you shocked us when you reminded us of how much we're losing in that vein. Also, I think there is a growing number of people that believe that humans have a moral responsibility to protect the self-interest of wildlife. Now, who does this conservation? Because in our country, the legal authority for wildlife management is divided between the states and the federal government. And of course, Adrian's right about the tribal responsibility also on their lands as a sovereign nation. This idea has sort of propagated a misconception that it's the states and the federal government that do wildlife conservation. And this is wrong. Academics like Adrian, 133 published papers, are certainly doing wildlife conservation. Nonprofits are doing wildlife conservation. And increasingly, people on their private land are doing conservation. So I think this who needs to be rethought. And really, wildlife conservation, there's an institution of wildlife conservation that incorporates all of these elements. And then how is this done? How does this institution, how do all these different components work to get conservation done? And whether we describe it very well or not, there's a bunch of principles, ecological principles, principles of governance that are important, and moral principles. So I think that, as we move forward in the future, the big hope of wildlife conservation is that there'll be a growing consensus of what those principles are that guide the management of state wildlife agencies, federal agencies, and all the other players in wildlife conservation.
Any follow-up thoughts by the panelists?
Yeah, I'd love to. I agree with everything I've heard, and I want to reemphasize and underline some points. Louisa, fellow travelers, exactly. These wild animals are not tools for humans to play with or dominate. They are our fellow travelers, and they deserve consideration. And I've argued they deserve legal standing in courts when humans are talking about exploitation and extraction. And for that, we need our government to live up to the ideals and principles of our democracy and constitutional principles and Supreme Court common law. So we do need fundamental reform at the grassroots. And as Fred said, I agree 100%. This view of agencies as working with their clients or customers really needs to be rethought, reconsidered in light of our ethical responsibilities to nature, in light of the laws that this great country has developed over the centuries, and in light of emerging science and new ideas and new realizations about the harm we can do to our planet if we're not careful.
Okay, now that we're getting into sort of the divergence between what you all have identified as the ideal framework for conservation and the current system that we have, are the states doing enough to protect wildlife? If not, how is state management failing from your experience and perspective? Louisa, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, the fact is that most Americans are excluded from management of wildlife. And those who have a different ethos than the one of domination and use, defined as killing, are forced, being on the outside in most cases, to climb the ramparts and get access to the process. And this escalates conflicts. And, you know, we have a West that's rapidly changing, where I live, with survey after survey showing a dramatic shift, not just in the West, but across the country, from hunting to non-consumptive values. At the same time, hunter numbers have been declining proportionally to other values, non-hunters demanding more access to the decision-making process. So, and we also have, particularly in the West over the last 30 or 40 years, a wave of typically more affluent and often better educated people moving in to the Western states from both coasts and bringing with them different views and values and demands for less violent treatment of wildlife. And this is a huge threat to rural Westerners, you know, those who now dominate state game and fish agencies and commissions. So it's a problem of exclusion, but it's also a problem of the culture. The culture of hunting permeates the agencies themselves and thereby increases conflict. So, you know, we tend to think of subsistence hunters putting meat in the people, putting meat in the freezer. And I have many friends who do, but look at the iconography of hunting magazines that tell a really different story. Hunting as expression of manhood, killing a big buck with sex-linked organs on its head to prove your virility. And magazines depict typically white males posing with guns over dead animals with large horns and antlers. And this bespeaks a deeper problem, you know, a cultural problem, hunting to prove your manhood by killing another sentient being. So a lot of the debate and a lot of the conflict is within this larger cultural context. You know, it's about manhood, not meat. And in the case of large carnivores, it's about revenge. I don't know if I have time, Kevin, but there's a little story on that point that I thought I might share. I was at a hearing in Cody and was surrounded on wolves and was surrounded at the break by a sea of cowboy hats around me. And this guy, Wes Livingston, stepped forward and he shook my hand and he wanted to talk. And he basically said, look, I don't have anything against wolves, but, you know, we can't control beef prices. We can't control the weather. We can't control rich Easterners buying land, but we all have us a gun and we can kill a wolf. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. Fred, how about you?
Well, states enact wildlife conservation through state wildlife agencies. And I think it's important to first look at the context. Each state, including District of Columbia, have fish and wildlife agencies. And I think we often, those that are not hunters or anglers, forget how much infrastructure these agencies, when you put it all together, they have. It's huge. Their annual budgets are over $6 billion. 34,000 employees work at these state wildlife agencies. We often forget how much land, and it's hard to get the exact figures, but how much land the state wildlife agencies have some sort of jurisdiction over. It's probably at least 10% of the country. So these, when you put it all together, which we rarely do, and think of it as part of the conservation institution, it's hugely important. Now, I think they've been stuck, and we'll talk about it more a little bit later, they've been stuck in a paradigm that doesn't allow them, or they just haven't moved forward. But I guess it's sort of like that old Peace Corps ad, you know, is the glass half full or half empty, or is it half full and half empty, which way you look at it? So are they failing though? Yeah, unfortunately they are. And it's easy to start throwing around blame. And I think it's sort of like Pogo said, you know, look at the enemy and he is us. That it's everybody really. But anyway, back to the story. So the story is the state wildlife agencies, they're falling down on non-game management because of their historic focus on game management and commercial fishes, for example. So they're falling down on non-game. They're also falling down on being able to have the leadership as this transition between consumptive use of wildlife to the realization that biodiversity is the foundation of everything we do. This leadership change that needs to happen to start aligning the agencies and the work more with biodiversity conservation of all species, it just isn't happening. And so, you know, I hate to say like they failed, because they are trying, I think, in many states. And again, I hesitate to even talk about the average agency because you have to realize there's a lot of diversity between the 50 states. But on average, they aren't doing the non-game. They're not showing the leadership of change. They're also not reaching out again, realizing that conservation is really this collaborative of all these different players, different agencies. It isn't just the Fish and Wildlife Agency in each state, transportation agency, education, the parks, so many different agencies, and then the academics, the nonprofits, and the state wildlife agencies. My observation has been as well, they do reach out and they form partnerships and they have made progress. They just aren't able, and we'll talk about that more later, they just aren't able to be where they need to be in 2020 in the face of that crisis, Kevin, that you described earlier.
Adrian, what do you think? Are the states doing enough to protect wildlife?
They vary a lot, just like Fred indicated. There's diversity in the state agencies. The pattern is very clear, and many scholars have looked at it, including Susan Clark out of Yale University. The pattern is that they do quite well for hunters, trappers, anglers, hounders, and they protect the animals those people care about. But back to Louisa's point, that's a narrow minority and not a heterogeneous group of people. And that's a problem for governance in a democracy. And I feel like the state agencies, the state wildlife agencies, often pay lip service to several ideals, such as democratic wildlife governance, such as being science-based. And here I'm citing the work of Kyle Artell, now at University of Victoria in Canada. Together, we all looked at 666 wildlife management plans across North America and basically produced a scorecard of how scientific were their management plans. And it's not a pretty picture. I also think state wildlife agencies pay lip service to their duties to the broader US public, which is current and future generations. So lots to improve.
Yeah, and I think it's worth interjecting some points of information here for our members of the audience who may not know these things. Approximately 5% of the US population over the age of 16 actually hunts. Something like 12 or 13% fish. So together those groups are definitely in the minority in terms of the overall population. And then as far as the structure of state wildlife governance, typically states will have a state wildlife agency that is overseen by a commission, a wildlife commission that is either actually has oversight authority or is advisory to the agency. And members of those commissions are typically appointed by the governor. And hunters and anglers and agricultural interests dominate the membership of those commissions. So in terms of governance, the whole system is dominated by people with a particular view, what we call consumptive users. So I just wanted to throw that out there for people that might not know that. Any follow-up thoughts on?
I would just add that what you just said, Kevin, it kind of then becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, situation where it's positive feedback that the boards and the commission, have particular stakeholder interests that then continues the more traditional mandate of the agencies, which is, consumptive use, and it just can't get out of that loop. But I would add that, one of the things we'll get to later probably that I find very unfortunate is that, again, in a democracy, these appointments, ultimately should be controlled or influenced by people getting engaged in voting. So, if the governor is making these appointments at some point in the process, if we're going to get out of this kind of continual traditional approach to wildlife conservation when there's so much need to expand it, then there has to be a change at the political motivation. And we'll talk about that more, why there might not be the motivation of politicians to change.
Yeah, if I could jump in with an example, Kevin, if we have time. I think wolves and to some extent grizzly bears provide an excellent example of where our agencies are doing things, I think, not suboptimally on many criteria. So you take the popularity of wolves across the US, and here I'm citing research by Jeremy Bruscotter and Christina Slagle out of Ohio State University. Wolves are more popular even than they were 30 years ago, and an overwhelming majority of the US public wants them conserved and protected. And yet when the federal government takes them off the endangered species list, the response of states that host wolves is to hold unsustainable and unaccountable levels of killing, a lot of legal killing with permits that is shadowed by illegal killing that the agencies have turned a blind eye to. So this is an area of research I've looked at for the last 15 years. And it's a shocking example of where wildlife agencies are purporting to conserve wildlife while at the same time doing the bidding of very narrow interest groups. Louisa knows this as well, I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean, I can't help but jump in on this topic because large carnivores really, in many ways, bring out the best and the worst of our current governance system. So they're kind of a glaring example. And one thing that I see, and it's really unfortunate, is how these agencies are in an existential crisis, of identity. They've been formed and structured one way with fiscal dependencies that we'll talk about, and yet the public is demanding something else. And so you have this lockdown, bring the covered wagons in a circle and just start shooting reaction, which is just incredibly unhelpful. And one concrete example was just 2 years ago after grizzly bears, Yellowstone grizzly bears were stripped of their federal protections under the Endangered Species Act. And the ink wasn't even dry when the Wyoming Game and Fish officials decided to unleash a trophy hunt on grizzlies the first day they legally could. And, this is trophy not meat situation. And this was in the face of, 270 tribes speaking out against the hunt because grizzlies are relatives. And 99.99% of the public comments received by the government on the step opposed trophy hunting. And what did they do? Basically, put their middle finger in the face of the larger public. So it's, and that's really, without being too judgmental, because I just said something pretty judgmental, it's really a reflection of the existential crisis that the agencies are in.
I think it's important to remember, I'll probably say it several times tonight, that there is a diversity of states out there. And yes, I think they all realize that they need to change. And I think they're trying in different ways. And I think it would behoove all of us to try to start looking more at the states that are making progress and use those as case studies on why maybe they did. My own sort of very casual observations, and this is for the young people out there in the audience. Sometimes, I'll give you an example of Florida. One person or several people can really make a difference. And I think that while there's this overall average failing, that it's really behooves a larger audience than just the internal agency people to look at where is there some success, and how we might foster states with success working with states without the success and sharing those examples. I think the professional organization of state wildlife agencies, Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, I think they're trying to do this. I really do, and they've come out with some documents, but it's sadly glacially slow, in my opinion. But I do see some hope out there.
Thank you,
Yeah,
Fred. It is
just gonna
important to
add-
remember that the agencies are not monolithic. There are people trying to move in the right direction, and states are different. Yes, Adrian?
100%. I mean, one person can light a candle. It usually takes a team to achieve real change. Take the ballot initiative in Colorado about wolves that we'll probably turn to soon. A small number of people really got that started and were persistent and patient over years and could achieve change. And I don't think people should misinterpret our criticisms of agencies as personal attacks. We're talking about the structures of government that we, the people, decide on. So really, we're trying to persuade our listeners that democracy needs to act for justice in this case. I think that's what our criticisms are aimed at.
Thank you for that reminder.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so you've all identified some ways in which the states are falling short when it comes to wildlife conservation. Let's explore that topic a little deeper. Why do you think the agencies are performing below your expectations? Why do you think they behave as they have? Fred, I know you've thought a lot about this.
Well, I think we've touched on it some. They're just stuck in a paradigm that's out of date with today's needs, and that's this consumptive use model. I'm not saying that we want to stop hunting and fishing, not at all. It's just that the boundaries of what they do, the scope of what the agencies do, needs to expand, and in order to do that, there has to be a broader awareness of the general public of the urgency of this issue of biodiversity crisis, and that the states have such potential that's really not being realized. And the old sort of client model, Fish and Wildlife Agencies, 100 years ago, turn of the 19th century when they got started, 20th century, it basically was a client model. The hunters and the anglers were their clients, and permits and licensing and some excise taxes paid for most of their work. And then, it was no fault of the agencies that the world changed around them. The world changed in the need for more wildlife conservation, and also the social, ecological, moral base changed around them. And so they're kind of stuck in this old client model. And there's been efforts to start, you start seeing, I'm laughing because it's just words, but you start to see less talk about clients and more about stakeholders. Well, but the stakeholders, again, they tended to leave out the public general good that wildlife conservation, and the general public tended not to realize that an agency is there for them. And then it gets complicated. I could go on and on because the funding issue that, about 60% on average of state wildlife agency still comes from hunters and anglers and from excise taxes. And this idea that the agencies are doing all the conservation. And so the money gets all mixed up on who's paying for what. And so we just can't get out of this trap. And then it gets political. And once it got political, again, if we go back and think about how these agencies are managed and governed, primarily a governor appoints either a board or a commission or an individual commissioner who oversees. And so once you have this system of providing resources for a select group, a small group, it's hard to get out of it unless that democracy comes in and works, and the trustees of the wildlife, which are the politicians and the elected people and the appointees, unless they're made accountable for the desires of the population, which is really biological conservation for the good of all and for our survival, for that matter, it isn't gonna change. So, I do see, maybe I'm optimistic, but I do sense that we're at near a tipping point. And I think I could go on and on, but I think climate change kind of brought up the importance of urgencies, and the pandemic did too. And I think we're starting to realize that we need national strategies, whether it's a pandemic or a biodiversity plan, and we need more coordination, and we need to realize that the environment, the air, the water, the biodiversity, managing climate change, it's the foundation of everything. And not just our everything, but our children and future generations' everything. And so I think that, we just have to keep pushing us over this tipping point. And I'm hopeful that the agencies I think they're more ready than we might imagine. The 34,000 employees, I'm old, so I can say this. It's the younger ones that are, to me, the most hopeful. But, I think we're getting there. I really do.
That's
Well,
a theme I'd love to riff on, if I might.
Yeah,
Kevin.
Adrian, go ahead.
Yeah, Fred, 100%. I mean, it's about future generations. And I think they both inspire me with hope. The young folks I teach are a kinder, nicer, more thoughtful, and more visionary group than my generation was when I was coming through school. So I am optimistic about the future because of the next generation, because of their attributes. I'm just concerned that we didn't pay enough attention to them for many, many decades. I mean, states could not have eradicated wolves had they been thinking about future generations, because when one really starts to think about the future, we realize that preserving nature has the highest priority, not using it for short-term profits, for the gains of a narrow minority interest groups, not for trivial reasons like recreational killing. Especially when you talk about predators that are rare on the landscape, they're not very dense, they play critical roles in ecosystems. Those sorts of decisions would not have been made if future generations had been front and center. And that's why the metaphor of a trust, and it's actually a legal reality of a trust, is so important. A charitable trust is something you preserve as a legacy for futurity. You don't waste it all now, because that's so short-sighted. And I think if our state, tribal, and federal wildlife agencies begin to take their trustee duties seriously, that's when I start to get optimistic. And that's what I'm working towards for as long as I can while I'm kicking.
Thanks. Louisa, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with so much of what's been said, about the nature of the conflicts, why they exist, the historical role. The situation now with kind of an iron triangle, if you will, between the commissioners and the departments and state legislators, fueled by, as Fred and others have described, this funding system really based on, hunter license fees and taxes on ammunition and firearms and the like. And so it's a hermetically sealed system, but I agree with what Fred was saying. I think we really are at a tipping point. And I've seen some amazingly, promising trends. And really had an awakening of my own, which I may talk about a little later, working with the tribes all across the country, but mostly in the Northern Rockies, on the grizzly bear case, where they basically said, no, you are not going to hunt our relatives to put them on a rug. We're just not going to do it. So I think, Adrian talked about young people, but I think that minorities, especially Native peoples, really can help. Break the system open into a far more democratic system that we need if we're going to have wildlife and a planet.
Yeah.
I'm with you 100%, Louisa. And yeah, the tribes in Wisconsin have put their foot down because wolf is companion or brother in their creation story. They've put their foot down. The state has stomped on their toes at times. But things like the 7-generation principles are brought to us from indigenous groups, like some of the Native American tribal nations of the US. So there's a lot to follow, a lot to admire in their models of coexistence.
Another issue that I think has held the state agencies back is back when I was young, we tended to focus on species conservation and creating parks. And I think over the years, we've learned that we really have to talk more about ecosystem restoration and ecosystem and look at how systems work. And the state agencies, it's so complicated that so many different agencies and so many different players have to be involved in managing ecosystems that it's made it hard for the state wildlife agencies to really take more of an ecosystem approach. Like with salmon, for example, the tremendous problems with salmon in the Pacific Northwest. And it's often because we can't take an ecosystem approach. All the metrics we use, it's always how many can we produce? How many can get back to the hatcheries? How many can we take? It's all about allocation, rather than really focusing on ecosystem management. And part of the reason is because, again, the agencies are divided. The responsibility of biodiversity conservation is divided. And it's sort of like, sometimes I think it's everybody's in charge and nobody's in charge. And so I think a big issue for all of us conservationists is to figure out, how do we get better coordination? Certainly a national biodiversity plan would help, more state wildlife plans and biodiversity plans that are actually implemented would help. But this is I'm realizing that this is a bigger issue than most of us are thinking about, that, we need to manage now ecosystems. I'll give you another example. We tend, like with predators, again, it keeps coming back over and over again, is what are we really trying to do? What is the why? And with predators, for many biologists, it's almost like, and I have nothing against bird watchers, I like watching birds, but you know how bird watchers keep those check sheets, and it's like, yes, we got that one, we got this one. Sometimes I think that our wildlife agencies are doing the same thing. Yes, we have wolves in Washington state, but we have 120 of them. So is that what we're trying to do? Are we trying to have a check sheet? Or are we trying to bring back ecological function of predators in as much of an area as we can? And so this whole business, you're going to get tired of me saying it. We have to keep coming back to why and what are we really trying to do? And how do we set the goals, and how do we set the metrics, the things that we measure that are based on ecosystems and on ecological management and health, rather than just looking at species? Of course, the trap is most of our laws are, Endangered Species Act, are species oriented. But this is, I think, a much bigger problem holding back state wildlife agencies than most conservationists understand.
I'm going to spice it up a little bit, and with all due respect, Fred, disagree a little bit.
Okay, good.
I completely agree about the importance of ecological function and ecosystem management. However, I feel like, in my experience with mainly large predators, the agencies can easily get distracted about minor threats when they take an ecosystem perspective and ignore the major threat. Let me give you one example: the red wolf. One of the major interventions, millions of dollars sunk into stopping the hybridization of red wolves and coyotes. But their experts, as early as 2015, maybe earlier, were telling them that is a symptom of the problem. That is not the major threat. It's a symptom of a problem that too many of the red wolves are getting killed by people. And the agency did not invest much at all in stopping poaching. And I think a focus on the major threats, especially when they come from people, is needed before we can even have any meaningful ecosystem management. So I agree it's important, but first address the major threats to our species that are about to wink out.
Good point.
Yeah,
I agree.
And Fred, I agree with your point about the focus of conservation should not be on species preservation solely. It should be on, scientists like Paul Ehrlich have pointed out, it should be on protecting populations of wild animals in order to allow them to be ecologically effective across the landscape and contribute to the functioning of ecosystems that do in turn provide those ecological services that we all depend upon, and which provide for our quality of life and our very survival, things like clean air, clean water, pollination, etc. So it's not, we should not be focused on a bare minimum numbers of animals in order to prevent us from losing the species, but we should also be thinking about populations distributed across the landscape. And then I think a growing number of people are concerned about the interest of individual wild animals as well, and take the view that animals have intrinsic rights. You know, as Louisa mentioned, you know, these are our fellow travelers, and it's they're not resources. That view, a lot of people do not hold that view, and yet I think that might be the view that I know for a fact that is the view that dominates at wildlife agencies. Because when you go to my experience is, if you go to a wildlife commission meeting and you talk about the rights of individual animals, you're ignored. You are dismissed because that is not the right thinking.
I think in the beginning I mentioned about following up on that at the end of the day, and again, whether we write them all down like we should, there's a system of principles that we follow. And those principles are ecological, they're governing principles, but they're also moral principles. And Kevin, I think that what I see and what I predict is that this growing awareness of the individual animal in conservation is going to start dominating conservation discussions more and more. And again, the world's changing. And during my career, when I was a curator of mammals at the Bronx Zoo, and back in 1984, and people would often ask me, "Hey, Fred, do animals think?" And you know, it's kind of funny but I got that question often, and it used to irritate me to no end. And I used to always just say, "Do you have a dog?" And they, you know, most of them would say yes, or "Do you know somebody with a dog?" And I'd say, "So I'm going to ask you, do animals think?" And they, you know, they would say yes. But over the last 30 years, the science on the cognition of animals has changed. Our scientific understanding of animals has changed, and the appreciation of animals has changed. And so the moral principles behind how we are going to manage wildlife are going to change, and they are changing. And this is going to be one that another thing that we had better do as conservationists to improve state wildlife agencies and to improve conservation is to come up with some good mechanisms for how we're going to increase the democratic, Adrian, discussion of what these principles ought to be. You know, we have to not be polarized. We have to not use inflammatory words. We have to find how to bring people together. They realize that biodiversity is essential for their lives, and we're different, but that's our strength in this country. And we're going to together come up with a consensus of what those principles ought to be.
Well, that's a good segue into the next question. We've identified some, you know, an ideal conservation framework, or at least preferred, and areas where the current system falls short. And we've touched on some systemic, deep-rooted reasons for the shortcomings. So now comes the hard part, and we've talked about it all through this webinar so far. Where do we go from here? What can be done to transform state wildlife management, and who should do it? And what can each of us do as individuals? And Louisa, I invite you to kick that off.
Yeah, sure. I mean, first I'd like to follow up on some points that Fred was talking about bringing people together in a consensus framework. And in my experience with state wildlife agencies, and I've partnered with a lot of them over the years, it is far more successful when you're talking about habitat conservation or about public education. You know, in my case, I was involved in a long-term project with some states on radio PSAs in the springtime, you know, about bears. Bears are up, you know, where's your bird feeder? And, you know, stuff that's just a reminder of people that were living with these animals. And there's a lot of collaborative kinds of projects like that that are possible and can be really successful, as well as, you know, years of working in communities on systems of garbage management so that grizzly bears don't come into town and get into garbage and then, you know, more likely than not get killed. So there's a lot of collaborative possibilities in that. And at one point, I worked collaboratively with the state of Wyoming and Idaho in legal challenges of a bunch of destructive timber sales on an out-of-control national forest. And their interests, of course, were more related to elk and harvestable surplus, and mine were more related to grizzly bears, but we shared a common sense of alarm at what the Forest Service was up to. So I agree with Fred on that point that there is a lot of room, and my most successful, just to sort of take it up a notch, efforts have really been in areas where you could de-escalate the symbolic loading on a species. And you can do that in a specific place, in a specific context, with a specific group of people, including whatever, state personnel, are around. And where successful efforts happen, they happen because often there were really good state people or Forest Service people on the inside who you could work with, who had a common sense of purpose and mission to get something done and resolve conflicts. But the harder ones relate to the larger constitutive and structural change that is needed. Going back to what Adrian started with, using the public trust doctrine to advance representation in a democratic process for the broader public trust. A few years ago, I was involved in a project where we interviewed a whole bunch of State Department employees and state commissioners from a bunch of states, and they all agreed on this notion of the public trust, that is a way into building a broader consensus and understanding of how to manage wildlife. And it's particularly difficult when you're dealing with these nationally iconic species like grizzlies and wolves, which you talked about. And what happens when they're no longer listed under the Endangered Species Act? How do you give voice to all Americans, not just people confined in a particular state? So I think one way forward is the money. We need to get away from such high dependencies on hunter-related dollars and taxes and the like. We need to create a new national wildlife fund or biodiversity fund or whatever you want to call it, that, the purpose of which is to enfranchise all Americans with an interest in wildlife and decision-making, but it would replace through funding the notion that you're dependent on a harvestable surplus and rather more a broader understanding of wildlife. And as Adrian was saying, in the face of mounting threats, what are they really? And so we need a way bigger slug of money than what you can get through state lotteries or state general funds. And I think the time has come for creating a new tax on outdoor recreational gear. It's been talked about forever. If we can tax firearms and munitions, we should be able to tax binoculars and backpacks. Something that recreationists across the board, it would help wildlife. People would be willing to pay if they understood, I think, what it was going for. And I think there could be a big new slug of federal wildlife dollars could be created with the new tax on renewable energy sources. And in this context of a big funding program, the Pittman-Robertson, the tax funds related to hunter dollars need to be rolled in so that you're managing that program within a broader context for wildlife for everybody.
Adrian?
So I'd like to pick up on that. I'm intrigued by Louisa's idea about parallel excise taxes or some sort of tax on those outdoor recreational non-consumptive items. But I'm concerned that we're not accounting accurately for all the taxes through general revenues already paid by non-consumptive users, through park fees just for visitation where no one's killing any animals. Those aren't being properly accounted for when they go into the wildlife, the wildlife revenues, at least in my state, and as I understand it, in other states. So I think first we need reform of governance before revenue streams are going to be used properly. Otherwise, I fear we're just going to be empowering basically oligarchs, right? And very small commissions that have some really strange rules. Like I believe in New England, there's some wildlife commissions that require you've had a hunting license for 5 years to sit on that wildlife commission. That's a system of patronage that opens up commissioners to corruption. So I think we do need fundamental reform. It's going to have to come both from the grassroots and from the top, with governors making wiser decisions, putting people on these commissions and boards that are trained as trustees, not as trained as representatives of interest groups. And that's because a trustee, especially a fiduciary trustee, one who is obligated to care for and manage valuable resources for the future, those trustees will make decisions about hunting regulations and closing hunting and protection of habitat and protection of non-game. They'll make all those decisions in a way that's not colored by interest group preferences. So that's what I would suggest as a starting direction. And there's a legal basis for it. The Supreme Court has been upholding public trust principles since 1842 in a famous case in New Jersey that had to do with oysters. And then the landmark case of Illinois Central Railroad. So the Supreme Court is backing it. What we lack is the political will of the agency heads, I believe, of the governors, to stand up and say, we need trustees. Now I'm going to get super granular on you too. Let's get back to the numbers game. We were talking about how an excessive focus on the numbers of wildlife is a problem. I think it's a problem because it ignores the individuality of animals. It treats them as numbers. You can replace one for the other. There's no consequence of killing an individual animal. If we break the numbers game, which is a mindset of managers that really that relates to hunting, right? If we break the mindset of the numbers game, let's replace it with one about the geography game. The expansion of wildlife range into new places can help to heal and restore ecosystems. So if we think about geographic range, not the numbers of animals, we step away from the sort of interchangeable parts, ignoring the individuality of animals. That's one change I'd make, and I already alluded to. Focus on the major threats from people, abate those. That's another solution I'd suggest. Sorry, I went on and on, Kevin.
No, it was great. Some very good points. Fred?
Yeah, I wanted to add that this whole business of funding, as the role of wildlife agencies expanded, primarily after the 70s and endangered species came in, but their funding didn't. There's been talk, as Louisa said, endless talk about taxing other user groups. In 2005, the federal government did put out a request to all the states to produce state wildlife action plans. And they identified conservation of need species, and there's thousands of these need species.
16,000.
2,000, oh boy. And so, yeah, so over since 2005, the states have been getting money. The total is, to all the states, is about $61 million, I think, at last counting. And then it's matched by that amount by the states. But anyway, recently, somebody looked at it, and the real need is like $1.2 billion a year. Okay, so remember I said a while earlier that $6 billion a year is about what the states are spending. And they're about 1.2 billion short for the non-game part of it. And there is some hope there that there is a Recovering America's Wildlife Act up that would provide that money through the oil and energy funds. But I want to say something, Louisa, about the idea of taxing, another excise tax. I think what's needed really is a new vision for what the wildlife agencies are. I don't think you get new money until you have a new vision and can really specifically say what you're going to do with that new vision. And I think that, ultimately, what we have to do is convince everybody, again, you've heard me say it 3 times now, here's the 4th time, biodiversity is the foundation of everything we do. It's not just nice to save. It's not going bird watching and hiking on the weekend. It's essential for everything. And so I really think the money has to come out of just general tax money because everybody is a stakeholder in biodiversity. It's more similar to transportation or education or military defense. It's really security. And so I hate to see just to say oh, well, if you go bird watching, you pay some extra, because this really keeps the same idea of client, pay or use. We got to get beyond that. This is survival. This is, and when I was young, again, we used to talk about the 7 generations. But, I think one thing that's moving people, and we're getting to the tipping point, it's not 7 generations anymore. It's like our own life. I used to think it would be like our kids' lives. Now I'm thinking, like, even though I'm retired, it's in my life. I mean, a lot of this is falling apart by 2050. I think we need a vision, and we need to get people to realize this is general tax money that needs to protect the biodiversity of the world we live in.
100%.
Great answer. So
Mhm.
I heard we need new funding for the agencies. We need a new vision for them, maybe a mandate. I've heard we need to democratize the governance. Some great ideas, and so I want to pivot now. Fred, you have mentioned several times the need for people to engage politically in order for politicians and to see that wildlife conservation is a priority. It's not just a luxury or something for a fringe group of consumers. So that brings up the next question. We are in a moment in this country and the world of heightened awareness of longstanding injustices and invigorated movements to address them, such as Black Lives Matter, Me Too, Indigenous rights, etc. Wildlife is not usually included on the broader social justice agenda. Do you see a connection between these social justice movements and state wildlife management reform? If so, what are the common threads? Are there other progressive movements that can help us build a new coalition aimed at transforming state wildlife management? And how do we in the wildlife conservation community make those connections? Let's see. Fred, you want to start us out?
I think the answer is absolutely yes. I think that, again, this idea of broadening the realization that everybody has a vested interest in this, and that by reaching out and partnering with other organizations that are about change, about health, about equity, about justice, we're broadening that to include justice for wildlife. We're broadening that to include health for everyone. And I think that certainly there's other conservation movements that we're not really partnering with in state wildlife agencies. Climate change itself, climate change and nature are the two aspects of the environment that should be going hand to hand. There's no use solving climate change if we don't have any nature left. Okay, there's no use having nature if we don't have equity and justice in a democratic society, because we won't have a democratic wildlife system. So all these kind of progressive movements to improve the world, we need to link up. We need to show that we'll have richer discussions. We'll have more compelling arguments if we do this. More heads are better than one. And I think that we're kind of missing the boat. One fact I recently learned, I'm ashamed to say, is that I was investigating a little bit about the 30 by 30 movement. And that's a movement here in the United States, but also globally. And I didn't know that 5% of the human population of the globe are indigenous people, but they oversee 20% of the wilderness land that's left.
Mm-hmm.
So you can reach out to indigenous people because you want to be just and fair, but if you want to save the nature, you better reach out to those folks and work with them. So there's lots of just plain old factual reasons why we need to bring these groups together. Plus, you know what else? It's the right thing to do.
Right. Louisa, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we've been talking about social justice a lot tonight in various different ways, but I mean, to me, social justice is about empowering the unempowered and those disenfranchised by the current system of white men disproportionately who gravitate towards positions of power over wildlife. And what I have been trying to talk about is a vision of empowerment of women and minorities and tribes and wildlife watchers who've been disempowered. But in my work with tribes on grizzly bears and some other efforts over the years, it's clear that they need a couple things. They need more capacity in kind of functional terms, in experience, skill, resources, their ability to engage with the process. But they're not going to engage with the process unless there is a really trustworthy system of governance that is tied to openness and accountability and deep, deep listening, because there's such a history of disrespect. And we have a long, long way to go. And, you know, without throwing in another war story, I'll do just that. A few years ago, in the beginning of some of the grizzly bear efforts, there was a meeting chaired by the state of Wyoming Game and Fish on grizzly bears and trophy hunting. And in came a man, James Walksalong, who was the National Cultural Historical Preservation Officer for the Northern Cheyenne, sent by the Northern Cheyenne tribe, the council, and the president to deliver a statement on grizzly bears. And of course, Bear Butte is their centerpiece of their, sacred landscapes after the grizzly bear. And he got up after a presentation ostensibly about coordination with tribes by a white guy. And he went toward the microphone, and the state game and fish guy, who's now the director of the agency, ordered his microphone to be pulled and basically manhandled him. And you can see the video of it, of him, snapping gum in his mouth as he pushes Walksalong. And Walksalong was not just a member of the public like I was. He was a sovereign nation, a representative speaking in a nation-to-nation context. So we have a lot from that as a baseline, and that was 2015 in Wyoming. We have a really long way to go, and we cannot provide justice without transforming the situation around governance and how science is used.
Wow, that's a powerful story. Adrian, what are your thoughts?
Well, I agree with everything that's been said. I think one thing that's been left unsaid, I would want to cover, is that justice needs to extend to the non-human world as well. Otherwise, we're always going to have injustice. Just take the simple fact that humans get legal standing in court almost always, and animals do not. Individual animals do not, and therefore animals will always lose when it comes down to a conflict between an individual and an animal, no matter how trivial the human need or issue is. So I think legal standing is going to be important in our system, as flawed as it is for animals. And we're part of the justice movement is to get equal protections under the law and due process. And here I want to mention the atmospheric trust litigation taken up by the 21 youth plaintiffs in the Juliana versus US case, which is about climate change and holding the US federal government to task for failing to protect the environment for futurity, failing to protect those youths' climate and environment. And the US constitutional clauses they invoked are equal protections and due process, that future generations deserve equal protections under the law that current adults are taking. So really, I see this as a battle across many, many fronts. Whatever flavor of justice you're looking for, it's a fight to wrest control, authority, and wealth from a very, very small minority elite, usually men, who have claimed it historically and often by force. So it has a lot of similarities to the civil rights movement. And here, I'd like to add a word about consensus. We have to be careful with consensus. It has its limits, it has its uses, but it also has its limits when it comes to certain decisions about who benefits and who loses. Because in a consensus process, the youth are almost never there, and we do a pretty poor job of representing their interests. And certainly non-humans having no voice are never there. So consensus processes do those forms of life an injustice. So be careful about consensus. Use it to build shared vision and working together, but not when it comes to decisions about who wins or loses. For that, we need trustees that are tested and accountable and transparent and can be removed when they fail.
Thank you all for those answers. It's very insightful. At this point, we have about 20 minutes left in the webinar. I'd like to open this up to questions from the audience. Now, we won't be able to get to all the questions tonight, but we do hope to try to answer the ones we don't get to in the weeks that follow and post responses on the Species in Peril website. I have to say that's aspirational, but we will do our best. So let's see. First question. Louisa and Adrian's point about integrating tribes more meaningfully in land management seems so poignant. So much of what's being said here echoes tenets of traditional ecological knowledge and indigenous science. How can we support, promote, and maintain tribal co-management models on more public lands around the nation? Who would like to take that?
Well, I can jump in support of what the point that is being made. I mean, I was involved with a number of tribes years ago in the first, in our part of the world, the first large co-management experiment on public land. It had to do with the sacred medicine wheel in the Bighorns that had been used for many thousands, probably thousands of years by a whole lot of tribes, and the Forest Service was up to doing stupid stuff. And we basically secured, I played a bit role. I mean, they were the leaders and they did it. But it was really a great example of the Forest Service backing off and agreeing to a share model of how that wheel area would be managed. And that is what, in effect, the grizzly bear case is about, is that the tribes have been asking through this treaty that was signed by like 270 tribes and tribal traditional societies. They've been asking for a more meaningful seat at the table, and they should be able to get it. And I think there's a lot of promise in expanding the models, but what you have to do is understand fundamentally different ways of knowing the world. And the government's not particularly good at including traditional ecological knowledge when compared with, say, other ways of knowing through the scientific arena. And so it's a really tricky kind of mess. It gets to questions like how you know what you know. And so I think it's a really good topic, but it's super complicated. And you know, there's a lot of quicksand, but there's a lot of opportunity.
I agree 100%, Louisa. I would only add that traditional ecological knowledge, TEK, is a double-edged sword. We have to be careful about it because the white trophy hunter who goes to Southern Africa will claim to have traditional ecological knowledge too. I'm more concerned, so I'm a firm believer in the scientific method and applying the most rigorous standards of evidence from the Western scientific tradition without any delusions that scientists are objective and value neutral, fully objective and value neutral. Having said that, I believe we owe a debt of respect and listening to the tribes around us, and we have to remember that they're sovereign nations with their own interests and values, and they're our neighbors, and we have to come to agreements with them and then abide by our agreements. I think the most heinous historical acts of the US government and of states have been when they've broken treaties and agreements, written agreements with the tribes. So we have a lot to improve on.
If I can make one final point, I was only really able to engage with the tribes in a meaningful way when I retired from conservation in a formal way. And when other people sort of in the conservation movement asked me sort of, how do you do it? I said, you know, you have to drive a lot of miles, you have to sit in people's living room, and you have to listen a lot. And the problem is the way management and conservation, you know, agencies and non-governmental environmental groups are kind of the same, really limited, fast, gotta move. That is not how this works. This works in a very sort of deeper time zone of deep listening that we're not particularly good at in modern society.
100%. A quick anecdote about that. I've done 3 research projects with tribes in my region. over 13 years. That is, for an academic, such a slow rate. I'm not criticizing it, but it's a rate at which academia doesn't thrive. And so one has to be so patient to get the rich dividends of collaboration with the tribes on research, just speaking from the science angle.
Fred, do you have anything to add?
No, I would just very briefly say, I think we have to get better at partnering with all communities.
Mhm.
And I think that, like in Washington State, there's an idea of a community forest, for example, that's basically co-management. I worked in Belize for many years, and there, all the parks are co-management with the local Mayan or Garifuna communities. So I think really the wildlife agencies have been insular, and I think they need to reach out to all communities and indigenous people.
Mhm.
Okay, our next question. How can the majority of us who value wildlife for what they are engage public opinion to pressure managers to address our concerns? Relatedly, I am interested in what we as a community can do to take advantage of a new administration and working on wildlife in each state.
Well, I'll start it off. I said it before. You got to engage, and you got to show up at the Wildlife Commission meetings. You have to testify. You have to write letters. You have to talk. I mean, it's just the same old advocacy stuff you hear all the time. But my experience in Washington State has been that people do show up at the commission meetings, but usually when they have a particular contentious, argument, they tend to be the same people. We have to have many more people engaged. So I would encourage you, that question, who asked the question, the person who asked the question, you got to find out, who are the commissioners? What are their backgrounds? You have to reach out to your representatives and ask, who's making these appointments, and how are they being made? And another point I would make, I would also talk to your, any conservation organizations you belong to. Because again, here in Washington State, one of my frustrations has been that many of the conservation organizations don't really want to engage with the Fish and Wildlife Commissions because it's contentious, because it has to do with hunting and angling, and they don't want to get into that. And again, they're trapped in the paradigm that we've been talking about. They too think that these are fish and game organizations. So you have to use all your connections to get connected and to speak up.
Mhm.
And one other thing, sorry, go on too much. Also, the state wildlife agencies have lots and lots of volunteer opportunities. And so I first got interested really and knowledgeable about the Washington State Fish and Wildlife by volunteering to be on an advisory committee for non-game. And this, one thing led to the next. I served on different committees, and I got to understand better their perspective, and I hope I, maybe influence them a bit. And so, there's, nothing better than starting as a volunteer slowly and observing and finding out, what's going on. Engage, engage, engage.
Can I pick up on that, Louisa? We hear these stories that like the top athletes have done 10,000 hours of their sport, or chess masters have made 10,000 moves. You really have to do the one thing you do well, do it 10,000 times. Practice, 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 whether it's writing or speaking or demonstrating, or teaching others, or give 10,000. Just find your specialty, practice it with passion, keep learning.
Yeah, I can jump in on that quickly. I mean, back to part of the question was related to this administration. I think there's lots of people talking to the incoming administration. And I think, I think we're seeing through the Black Lives Matter protests and increased awareness of the plight of minorities in this country, combined with finally climate change. We can finally get to talk about climate change as the global problem that it really is. So, And I think wildlife, and there's recognition that climate change is imperiling our wildlife and biodiversity across the planet. And you're hearing Biden, President-elect Biden even talk about, that connection, climate change, birds, bees, bears. We got a problem here. So I think that we're going to see kind of a melding, hopefully, or coordination, and because there's so many overlapping aspects of the protest movement with Black Lives Matter, the climate change movement, and the energy movement, which is sort of part of the same thing, and wildlife. I think it needs to be part of the same. But getting back to the grassroots part that Adrian and Fred have been talking about, I mean, I never cease to be amazed at what people don't know about wildlife in their state. I mean, really basic stuff like, people who live in Phoenix don't know that mountain lions are hunted in Arizona. I mean, really? But it's true. So, I mean, from a standpoint of somebody looking to get involved, given that these issues are state and hopefully increasingly national, it's important to kind of plug into the groups who are working locally and statewide. And I have to say that environmental group capacity is not very good, at least on the national, they're not very good at plugging in on statewide stuff. I mean, you have groups like, the Southwest Center and Kevin, who are great, but and Project Coyote, you've got a lot of groups out there, but we're all trying to, we've all got a different piece of the elephant and it's not working all that well. But in a certain state like New Mexico, go to Kevin. I mean, you'll get a lot there and of information, at least in orientation, and then go to a commission meeting and try to get a better grip yourself on what you're in it for and what you're up against, because you will see it and you will feel it about how if you want to navigate in that, mud pit or as it exists, or you want to try to help. I mean, different people are better on the streets or better in academia or better being litigating attorneys. So it's about what is in your soul that speaks to you as to how you can engage that.
Yeah, if I could just jump in here. Thank you, Louisa, for that plug. It has been my observation in 30 years of wildlife advocacy that most wildlife advocacy groups have really ceded the territory at the state level. They really have engaged, focused on the federal level. And I think that's primarily because the Endangered Species Act offered so many opportunities through litigation to make progress, whereas the states, there aren't the opportunities for litigation, and it's really much tougher to make progress at the state level. But I think that's changing. I'm seeing more and more groups show interest in what happens at the state level in terms of wildlife decision making. And I would advise people not just to engage, but to don't be ashamed of your values. Don't be ashamed of leading with your values, because that is how that is one tool that is used by the people in power to dismiss your views, to maintain that they are the experts, and to hold up science when they really aren't following science, but they're holding up science as the most important filter for making decisions, when in reality decisions about wildlife are at root are value decisions. Science will tell us how many mountain lions we can kill in any given year and not cause the population to decline. But science can't tell us if we should be hunting mountain lions at all. That's totally a value decision, and your values matter as much as anyone else's. So go to the commission meetings and say, I don't want, if this is how you feel, I don't want mountain lions. I don't think mountain lions should be hunted. And also in New Mexico, it's a small state, so this might not work in other states, but it's very easy to get to know your state legislator. I know all of them in my county. There's probably 8, 10, I don't know. And we have worked in recent years to really develop a wildlife caucus within the legislature. And we got a coyote killing contest ban passed last year. And that was, we're beginning to see results of that effort. So engage. I agree with with Fred and the others. Okay, we have time for maybe one more question. Are there historic examples of legislation that reconciles the interest of trappers, hunters, and conservationists alike? Is this a non-existent premise?
Could I speak to that from the point of view of the public trust, Kevin?
Yes, please.
So the public trust doctrine basically says that the government's the trustee for the benefit of current and future generations to preserve wildlife or any element of the environment and regulate its use. So use is built into the public trust doctrine, but not to the extent that we see it now. What we have is overuse. The public trust has been sort of hijacked by these narrow interest groups to do disproportionate use and not enough preservation. So the public trust doctrine embodies our traditional customary uses. It doesn't make them illegal, although it is flexible and it evolves as society evolves. So that I would direct the questioner to more about the public trust. And let me add one additional element. Kevin, I think you're 100% right about how different values shape our wildlife management, which comes to the question as well. And don't feel defensive about having emotions attached to wildlife management. It's a very, in my experience, males in wildlife agencies will put down those who get emotional about wildlife issues. If you feel put down in that way, turn around and ask them about animal rights. You'll see them get emotional too. Everyone should be comfortable with their emotions. It's a guide to when our conscience has been triggered. Emotions are important guides to what is right or wrong. Thanks.
All right.
Yeah, I'll jump in briefly. As far as the questioner's interest in legislation, there's been a long recognition of the limitations of our existing legislative frameworks related to wildlife, statewide and certainly nationally. We've leaned hard, too hard, some people say, on the Endangered Species Act to do the lifting for ecosystems and a whole bunch of things. And there's been discussion, but absolute failure over decades to look at what I think Fred was talking about earlier, ecosystem-wide perspectives in a legislative context. But I think that's on the table now. I think this questioner may be pointing in the right direction. We need a new legislative framework for wildlife biodiversity because of the dire threats they face. And I think that's going to be on the table for this administration, and hopefully the debate will continue.
One
Okay,
example that's emerging right now is corridors. Corridors are supported by the hunting community and the wildlife community. So I would direct you there. A lot of neat stuff is happening with corridors.
Thank you, Fred. Thank you all. I'm afraid that's all the time we have. Thank you again to our distinguished panelists, and thanks to the team who made this webinar happen. And thank you all for joining us for this conversation today. A recording of this webinar will be made available on the Species in Peril website, along with recordings of the previous webinars in this series, as well as many other resources related to the biodiversity crisis. If you would like to learn more about the campaign to transform state wildlife management, I invite you to visit the Southwest Environmental Center's website at wildmesquite.org. This concludes the 2020 UNM Biodiversity webinar series. Thanks again to Senator Tom Udall, Representative Deb Haaland, and all of our partners who made this series possible. I want to especially acknowledge UNM's Dr. Subankar Banerjee and Renee Romo of Senator Udall's office, who more than anyone were instrumental in making the idea for this webinar into a reality. So thank you. Thank you all, and good night.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Ugh.